Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Energy Society podcast, where we explore stories of innovators shaping our future. My name is Dhruv Saini, and today we are honored to have Dr. Kelly Senecal with us. He's a renowned figure in mechanical engineering and transportation technology. Let me give you a brief overview of him. Dr. Senecal is the co founder and vice president of Convergent Science, where he has developed CONVERGE, a revolutionary computational fluid dynamics software. He holds a PhD degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and also serves as a visiting professor at Oxford. Um, Today, now I'll like to take you to the big part of his, which has inspired me to take this podcast, to record this podcast with him, which is his award-winning book, Racing Towards Zero, The Untold Story of Driving Clean, which advocates the balanced approach to sustainable transportation. And another thing of which has inspired me a lot is this TEDx talk on defense of internal combustion engines that has sparked global conversations on improving existing technologies for cleaner propulsion systems. So, Dr. Senecal is not just an engineering, but also a visionary leader committed to technology and inclusivity in engineering. And so, sit back and relax and listen to this podcast. And don't forget to like the video, comment your thoughts on the video, and share it with your friends and family interested in CFD. And do subscribe to our channel for more such interesting podcasts. Thank you. Okay, so sir, first question to you might be like, how is your daily life there at your company and other things? You're even adjunct professor at different universities.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. It's very busy. But I like to say, the alternative would be worse, right? I'm glad that I'm busy, lots going on, lots with the company, and I have several side projects as you know. I'm associated with the University of Oxford and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I do a lot of work. My day job is helping run Convergent Science, and we're a computational fluid dynamics software vendor. And we have lots of customers all over the world. So that's where I spend most of my time. But I also spend quite a bit of time advocating for technology neutrality in transportation. We'll probably get to that a little bit in the podcast here. And I like to travel. I like to travel and I like to speak in front of audiences and kind of get my message out there. And I've been known to write a little bit as well. So it's pretty busy. By the way, I also have a family, which keeps me busy. So there's a lot going on here in Madison. But everything's been great, and I really enjoy everything I'm into.
Today, to like to speak. You have been to TEDx talks, I guess.
I did a TEDx talk back toward the end of 2016. And then it was released on YouTube, I believe, maybe March of 2017, a few months later. And that's a good question, because that's really what brought me down this advocacy path that I'm kind of been on now for the last 8, maybe 9 years. Originally, when they invited me to do the talk, I was going to talk about the benefits of CFD and try to bring the concept of CFD to more of a public audience, right? People who are not ingrained in that day to day, and try to explain it to kind of a lay audience. But then a couple of weeks before the talk, I decided to pivot and change my topic. I started to see that, the death of the internal combustion engine was starting to come out in the media and things like that. That message was starting to come out. Of course, the IC engine is alive and well, as you know. So I did a pivot on the topic, and I instead talked about in defense of internal combustion. So I did that talk back then, and ever since I've kind of been down this advocacy path.
So you talked about the death of the internal combustion engine, but you have been said to love the internal combustion engine. In your book also, you have said that the battery electric vehicles are not the clear alternative towards cleaner energy. So for our viewers, can you please elaborate on the topic? Why is it not? Because they may not know. People still believe that if we have a battery, we have clean electricity, and there would be less CO2 emissions, but there would be life cycle emissions, non-tailpipe emissions. Can you please elaborate on those topics a little bit?
Yeah, there's a lot there, but I'll try to hit some of the highlights. And that's an excellent point. Back when I did this TEDx talk, 2016, I mean, some people didn't even really think that much about where does the electricity come from. right? As you said, they think, okay, it has a battery, I plug it in, it must be green. Of course, many people did think about it back then, but a lot of the general public wasn't really thinking about that. And I think in the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've come a long way. I think people are starting to think more about that. But there's still this idea out there that a battery electric vehicle is always going to be the best solution, right? And I definitely want to make sure I hit the point that oftentimes it is the best solution from an environmental standpoint. It just depends on where you are in the world, how your electricity is being made, right? Some places in the world are still very fossil fuel heavy when it comes to electricity. Other places like Norway, for example, they heavily rely on hydroelectric power. So battery electric vehicles make a lot of sense there. They are going to win the life cycle analysis, greenhouse gas calculation. They're gonna be better there. But in many places in the world, it's still not the best solution. And honestly, the environmental impact is a huge part of it. It's not the only thing that we need to be concerned about, right? We need to be concerned about the cost, the practicality. There are a lot of different issues, and the world is a big, diverse place. So what's really great for someone in Norway may not be great for someone in the United States. And even in the US, if you look at a state-by-state basis, some of the states, it makes sense to go battery electric now. Some states, it still makes sense to drive an efficient ICE or a hybridized ICE, not only from a practical standpoint, but also from an environmental standpoint. So really, I like to say the future is eclectic, right? It's not just electric. We need all of these different tools in our toolbox if we're really trying to kind of solve the problem.
Very well said. So you said that the future is eclectic. So I'll like to talk about the point of the eclectic highway, your podcast series which you had. I tried to open the website today. It was showing that it's not able to load. Is it still live, the website?
It should be still live. Although to be honest, I haven't been back to that site in a little while. If it's not live on the site, it will certainly be live like in Apple Podcasts or Spotify and things like that. So yeah, that was an interesting journey, that podcast. And I started that back in 2020 during the pandemic. A lot of things happened in 2020 when I found myself having a bit more time than I normally did, right? We weren't going out and doing things. We were kind of stuck at home for quite a while. So back in the early 2000s, I actually had a podcast. It was a music related podcast. It was actually one of the first podcasts. I don't think you can find it anymore probably. But I had a music collaboration website that I started with a friend of mine, and we did a podcast. So now fast forward till years later, 2020, I kind of wanted to get into it again and see what is the new technology around podcasts. Very different from what it was back in the early days. Much easier to, not that it's easy, but much easier to set up a podcast and distribute it than it was back in, say, 2006, 2005, 2006. So I had this idea to talk about some of these issues that we've already talked about here today, about technology neutrality and how there is no one-size-fits-all solution through a podcast. And I'd bring on, kind of like you're doing, I'd bring on invited speakers. And I did about 13 episodes, I think. I really did one season. I did one season of the podcast, and I had a lot of fun. One of the highlights was getting Professor John Haywood on the podcast, and I think that's probably one of the more popular episodes. That was a lot of fun. But I had a lot of really good guests, and it's not that I didn't like doing it anymore. It's just other things started to take priority, right? So I didn't end up doing a second season back then. Who knows what the future holds? I may come back to it at any point. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. And really the point of that was to talk about all the different things that come into play when you talk about transportation, right? There's infrastructure, right? There's the fuel, there's the electrical grid, like we've already talked about. Even things like CFD, like I do in my day job. So there are a lot of different aspects there, and really had a fun time doing that podcast.
Nice. Since we're talking about the podcast, can we talk about a little bit about your book, what motivated you to write the book, and how you collaborated with Mr. Felix for the book?
Oh yeah, that's a good story. Again, I had thought about writing a book for a few years, ever since I did the TEDx talk, and I got the response that I did, where some people were like, "Really? You're telling me my car isn't zero emissions?" That's how it was sold to me. I mean, things that if you think about now maybe seem a little far-fetched, but back in those days, the early days of sort of, I don't want to say the early days of the electric vehicle, because as you know, that's been around for 100 and some years, just as long as the ICE vehicle. But the early days was sort of the renaissance of the electric vehicle, I would say. And so hearing people's reaction to my TEDx talk made me think, okay, more needs to be said about this, right? And there's only so much you can say in a 30-minute talk or a 15-minute talk or a series of social media posts, right? There's only so much you can say, so much information you can convey there. This really needed to be a book to touch on all the various aspects. So again, in 2020, the pandemic, I found myself with a little more time than maybe I normally had. And I had recently met Felix, probably a couple years before that, and realized, Felix is a professor at University of Oxford. And I realized we had a lot of the same views or very similar views on the topic. And he had been doing some advocacy work as well. So we started talking about this idea, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about writing a book. You want to join me on this? And thankfully, fortunately, he said yes. And sort of the rest is history. But we wrote the book, he's in Oxford, I'm in the US. So lots of Zoom calls, lots of emails, a lot of collaborating on the book, through the internet. And fortunately, partly because of the pandemic, we had a lot of these collaboration tools in place where it wasn't so bad doing that, doing it remotely like that. And I think the end result turned out really well. We are actually in discussions to possibly put out a second version. And so second edition, we'll see if that happens. It's a lot of time. A lot has changed, right? We started writing the book back in 2020, came out in 2021. A lot has changed just in the few years since then. So I think a second edition is very much needed. We just need to carve out the time to do it and kind of agree on what the book will cover. But yeah, it's been a lot of there's been a lot of good stuff since we put that book out. A lot of good conversations, a lot of podcasts, keynote talks, things like that. Very good reception to that book. So thanks for bringing that up.
You said that a lot of things have changed since 2021.
Yeah.
So can you point out the things that have changed that is motivating you for the second edition of the book?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing, sort of a big picture thing is, back in that time, we were arguing against the idea that we should be going all electric and light duty, and arguing that that's part of the solution, not the full solution. I think since we put the book out, if you look back in 2024 even, and even into this year, a lot of the headlines you're seeing now isn't that companies are going all in on electric. It's saying companies are realizing not all the consumers want electric vehicles. It's not practical. It's not. So there's a lot of hybrids are starting to kind of have their day. And a big point of our book back then was hybrids should be the main focus, right? If we're truly trying to decarbonize as fast as possible and minimize consumer behavior changes and things like that, so they adopt things very quickly, hybrids should be the way to go. Again, not for everyone. Electric is still a big part of the solution, but hybrids should have a little more influence than they do. And we're seeing that now coming true, right? So what we were saying in our book is actually coming true now. And so I think there's a lot to talk about that. There are a lot of projections that were made about, by a certain date, the electric vehicles would have this much market share for new car sales and things like that. A lot of that's been updated. We talk quite a bit about hydrogen in the book, and there's new things to say about that, right? Because now 4 or 5 years later, there have been lots of advancements in hydrogen and hydrogen engines and fuel cell vehicles and things like that. So the historical part of the book hasn't really changed, right? Part of the book in the early chapters is about the history of the automobile and things like that. That hasn't really changed, of course, but some of the leading edge kind of stuff and the projections and things like that and the sales has changed quite a bit. So there's a lot there, which is why we're still debating on whether we want to take this on or not, because it's not just a quick second edition. It would be a pretty big rewrite of many of the chapters.
Nicely said. So you're a big vocal for the internal combustion engine. So can you explain the role of CFD in which helps you in analyzing ICs?
Oh, the role of CFD, yeah, it's huge. And I've been in this business for many years. Back when I first started doing CFD on engines, it was very much we had experimental data, and we were wanting to help explain why the data looked like it did, right? So CFD helped us look inside the engine, right? Because there you have access to every point in space and every time step as well, right? Every point in time, essentially. And you can really dive in and analyze what's going on in the engine. So you could use that to explain the experimental concepts. And you can use it also to help in the design process, right? Augment the experiments, but really CFD was more of a secondary thing back then. Now, if you look at what's going on today and in the past few years, CFD has really come such a long way, both in accuracy and speed. Now it's being used in a lot of companies to lead the design analysis, right? It's called analysis-led design. I can give you examples of this. One example I like to talk about because it was made public was Mazda's Skyactiv X engine, where they redesigned the engine completely using CFD first, and then said, okay, we now have our optimal design and our optimal combustion strategy. Now let's make the engine. Let's cut the hardware and make the engine that looks like that. And lo and behold, it worked. It worked great. So they saved a lot of money and a lot of time by doing the upfront CFD to design the engine and then kind of validate that with the experimental results. So CFD has really come a long way, and it really allows you to do lots of things that are hard to do experimentally, like change your geometry. Right, you can certainly do that, right? You can change your piston shape and cut new hardware and things like that. But doing that virtually with CFD is much easier. Just allows you to do a lot of things, allows you to do a lot of optimization. Of course, CFD still takes quite a while to run, much longer than a real-time engine cycle, obviously, but it's getting a lot faster. We're running on more and more cores now. It's more scalable. CPUs are getting better. We're even introducing some GPU stuff into the calculation and things like that. AI is also kind of augmenting some of the CFD. I'm a big believer that AI will not replace CFD, at least not anytime soon, but it can be used to kind of help get a solution maybe faster or give more insight into the solution. So CFD has come a really long way just in the last couple of decades. And it really is kind of pushing the boundaries of how you can design an engine virtually before you do it experimentally.
Nice. And since we are talking about CFD, can you explain a little bit about your company, Convergent Science, how it started, what were the hardship that you faced, and how's it going right now? Well, I know it's going well.
Yeah, we could talk for hours about that, but I'll give you sort of the nutshell description. Yeah, we were graduate students. My partners and I were graduate students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we wanted to stay in Madison after we graduated. Right, we really liked the area, and there weren't a lot of the engine companies, the auto companies tend to be in, Detroit or even in Illinois, like where Caterpillar is in Peoria. These are all nice places, but like we really liked Madison, wanted to stay in Madison. So we thought we were naive enough to think, let's start our own company. Yeah, that'll work. Fortunately for us, it did work, but there were some hardships along the way, as you pointed out. We originally were a consulting company, and we made meshes for customers for other tools, for other CFD tools, right? CONVERGE, our product, didn't exist yet. So we were making computational meshes for people. We were also helping them run their simulations, make design decisions on their simulations and things like that, and make them more accurate. We kind of got tired of the meshing process and thought, if we're really going to have a company that does consulting in this area, we want to be spending our time doing the engineering, not making meshes. Right, meshes for engines at that time could take days, weeks, sometimes even months. It just took a long time. And we developed a tool to make them pretty quickly, and it still could take days or weeks. And so we had this crazy idea, let's write a new CFD code from scratch where we remove that meshing bottleneck from the user. It still has a mesh. It's not a meshless method. There are methods like that, but it has a mesh. It's just made runtime. We call it autonomous meshing. The user just gives a few inputs in an input file or in the graphical user interface, and then the mesh is made automatically. And it's made every time step as the flow evolves using adaptive mesh refinement. So that was really what we actually started over as a company in 2008 because we went from a consulting company to now we had a product that we could sell, right? So we had to learn how to sell, market, support, all of those things that you have to do with a new product. And we were just a few people back then. And then our growth has been since 2008. Now we have offices around the world and distributors around the world. We have an office in India and Pune that's growing. And yeah, we're doing well. And we're not just doing internal combustion engine simulations anymore. We've branched out to lots of different areas because what we've learned is autonomous meshing is a good feature for anybody doing CFD to have, right? So now we're doing a lot of work in the e-mobility space, battery thermal runaway, electric motor cooling. We're doing wind turbine calculations. We're doing biomedical calculations, rockets, gas turbines, you name it. Anything with a complicated geometry and moving boundaries, we really shine our CFD solution. So that's where we are now. And that's a really quick version of the story. There were lots of ups and downs along the way, but we stuck with it and things are going really well.
Okay, so you said a word renamed adaptive mesh refinement that got my ear because recently we had a minus of computational fluid dynamics and Kaushik sir asked this question, what is adaptive mesh refinement?
Yeah.
And yeah, that time I didn't know the definition. Really, that hit hard because that was a question of, I guess, 4 marks.
So you didn't get it right?
No, I didn't get it right. I knew we taught in the class, but
sorry to bring that up.
Can
you answer it? Can you describe it now?
I still don't want to go about that.
Well, let me just talk about it just really briefly, because that is, and sorry to bring back the bad memories, that's in the past. Adaptive mesh refinement, if you have a resolution in your mesh, people like to say when you have gradients in a variable like velocity or pressure or species or temperature, that's where you want to add more resolution locally, automatically to kind of resolve what's happening there. We actually use the second derivative, not the gradient, but the second derivative. So that's where you have curvature, where you find curvature in the variable. So if you have a lot of action going on there locally, right, then a coarse mesh probably isn't enough anymore to capture that complicated flow scenario. So the code automatically adds cells when and where they're needed. And by the way, when they're not needed anymore in that area, it will remove them automatically as well to kind of keep your overall cell count reasonable and keep the simulation efficient. So now you know.
Yeah, he explained it to in the class and I was like, it was this easy and I just messed this question up somehow.
That's okay. You'll get it right next time.
Yeah, probably. I just kind of hear this thing now. I mean, like he designs the paper in such a way that there are lots of numericals which you may go if you have attended the classes, but the definitions he asked and whole of the class was like, we didn't study this.
Oh, really?
So that's really a nightmare for the class.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm not going to get into the details of his class here, but it sounds like it was a tough one for you, but you survived it.
And since we are talking about that, the class, though, can you explain your role as a professor at University of Oxford and Wisconsin Madison?
Yeah. So at University of Wisconsin-Madison, not currently teaching this class, but for several summers I would teach and I would co-teach with actually my partners here. We taught a CFD class on engine simulations. So Professor Jal Gandhi, who's a professor there at the Engine Research Center, he would teach the experimental side. So it was a really cool class because the students were able to kind of run experiments, right, and learn how to do that, whether it was a spray vessel or an actual engine, and then or a flow bench, and then they would run the same case essentially with the CFD. But what we taught in our lectures was, the fundamentals of the CFD. We sort of assumed you had some knowledge of CFD, but not too much. But then really dove deep into what does CFD mean for engine simulations? What are the important things you have to consider? The chemistry, the turbulence, the multi-phase flow, the moving boundaries and all this sort of stuff. So that was a really fun class to teach. We'll probably do that again in the future. Right now, the class isn't being offered, but that's what I was doing there. And then for University of Oxford, I have a visiting professor role. And mostly what I've been doing there is advising fourth year undergrad students, so seniors, and they have to do a project each year. And they've really, a few students have latched on to an LCA project that I put out there, right, where we've done the life cycle analysis of the US, and we have a paper on it, myself and colleagues. And the project was to do that same LCA analysis, but for Europe, right? Not just the UK, but for Europe. And so that's been a pretty successful project. The last student that did that did a really nice job, and hopefully we're going to be publishing that soon. So I'm not actually over at Oxford teaching, although that could happen. But currently, you know, it's more of a remote position where I interact with the students and the professors there, and advise some of these fourth year students. Yeah.
Since you're a professor at Tulane University, can you just briefly explain your educational background for the viewers?
My educational background? So I have an undergraduate degree in physics from a pretty small liberal arts school here in Wisconsin called Lawrence University. They don't have an engineering program. It's just the pure sciences, physics, math, biology, chemistry, computer science, and then all the liberal arts as well. What happened is even though I was a physics major, I was introduced to CFD between my junior and senior year of college, and I fell in love with it. And back then CFD was just in its infancy, right? But I was doing these calculations by hand or writing a little Fortran program to solve them, and then realizing I could do something much more complicated was using CFD. I fell in love with it. And so then I went on to find out, okay, what departments in graduate schools, I knew I wanted to go to grad school. What departments do CFD? A lot of them were in the mechanical or aerospace engineering departments. And I ended up coming to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, working on engines. And I didn't really love engines or care about engines much at the time, actually. It was just a hard application for CFD. And then, of course, going through that process, I fell in love with the technology and as well as the CFD. And I ended up getting both my master's degree and my PhDs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Yeah, really nice. So can we go ahead with some personal questions?
Yeah, for sure.
The first one we have here is how being a parent influenced your perspective on the future of transportation.
That's a good question. Of course, you know, I want to leave my kids with a better world than, you know, what I have or whatever, and certainly not a worse world. Clean air is important and all of that. So that's really important. And that's part of what drives a lot of what I do is, you know, we want to come up with cleaner solutions, more sustainable solutions. Sometimes it's electric, sometimes it isn't, right? But let's look at all the technologies. So of course, leaving my kids and grandkids with a sustainable future, right? That's a big motivation. But also, I like to show my kids that if you believe in something, it's important to speak up about it, right? And so I can be pretty controversial sometimes in my views when you're in an industry where everybody thinks we should be going light duty, all electric, and I'm saying, hey, wait a minute, no, I don't believe that, and here's why. Here's the science and the math tell you that that's not the case. It may be in the future, but it's not now. And so my kids actually, it's funny because they'll ask me, they'll say, can I borrow your phone? And they'll go on LinkedIn and they'll read the comment section. They love it when like I get into arguments with people. They just think that's the most hilarious thing. And so basically just as long as you do it in a respectful way, I think showing my kids that like, look, sometimes you want to go against the status quo because you think it's right, and it's okay to do that, right? The other thing that's interesting, my younger son who's 11, I'm looking for a new car right now, actually. I've had my car for like 11 years. It's time to get a new car. It's starting to have some problems.
The same thing was there. Thing was there in your book, right? You were looking for a new car with your children.
Well, there I wasn't actually looking for there I wasn't looking for a car for myself necessarily. I was just kind of showing them like what are the options out there, the efficient options with high MPG, miles per gallon that are reasonably priced. I wasn't actually looking for it for myself, but that was more of like, because my older son had come down, he came down from in the morning, woke up, and he was all excited because back then Tesla was still kind of a newish thing. And he's like, hey, have you heard of this Tesla car? Like, it's this and this and this and this, and it's zero emissions. And I was like, okay, we need to go on a little field trip, guys. And sort of explaining to them, like, what are the other options out there that are still very fuel efficient, but actually at the time, maybe less than half the cost of the Tesla, or maybe a third of the cost of the Tesla, right? So something that more people can afford. So that was that. Now I actually need a new car. The repairs that my car needs are starting to become more expensive than the car is worth, right? So I've kind of run the life out of this car for the most part, and now I need a new car. And my younger son is like, wait a minute. He sees me looking at different cars, and he's like, you have to get a hybrid. You have to get a hybrid. You're a hypocrite if you don't get a hybrid, because in your book, you say we should be driving hybrids. And I say, well, wait a minute. I don't say everyone should be driving hybrids. I just say that that's a good solution so he's sticking that, he's holding me to that. So every time, or if I go test drive a car, he'll come with me and he'll ask the dealer, like, is this hybrid? And so I'll probably end up with a hybrid. I think it's the right thing to do anyway. I don't know which car, but my younger son is really keeping me honest on that. He's like, you have to get a hybrid. And he reminds me pretty much every day. So yeah, we'll see how it turns out. But yeah, my kids are a big influence on, like you said, they're a big influence on the book, actually. Right, I told a couple stories of my kids. The other one was that I like to talk about in my presentations as well is my older son. He's now 20, or he'll be 20 tomorrow. When he was like 12, right, he was doing a science project, and I show a picture of this in the book where he says, what is the most climate friendly today, a car with an IC engine or a car with an electric motor? And his answer was, he did all the research and he didn't ask me for any help, which is people find hard to believe. He did completely on his own. And he came back with the answer, it depends, right? And that's in a nutshell, that's the future is eclectic. It depends. It depends where you are in the world. It depends on, your lifestyle, what you have access to and things like that, infrastructure and so on. So yeah, my kids are a big influence, not only from the sustainability standpoint, but they keep me honest, right? If I say something, especially if I wrote it down, they hold me to it. So yeah, it's a great question.
And since you have graduated from Wisconsin Madison and earlier been, can you explain how your life was there as an undergraduate and further as a graduate, so that we can relate as an undergraduate student that how our life is going compared to other times?
Yeah, well, that was a very different time too, right? I won't say what year. You probably know already, but it was a couple decades ago, or more. Yeah, my undergrad life, like I said, I was a physics major. I spent a lot of my time studying. I still had fun, and I was in a couple bands in college. Music is one of my biggest hobbies. I don't do as much now, but back when I was younger, I certainly did. So I made sure to have some fun as well, but I spent a lot of time studying, and because I knew I wanted to keep going in academia. At the time, I thought I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to go to grad school to be a professor. Once I got to grad school, I loved it, but I realized, maybe I need to take a break from academia for a while. It's something that if I ever retire from Convergent Science, maybe I go teach, and I have little roles here, like we talked about. I mean, I'm affiliated with Oxford in Wisconsin, but I'm certainly not doing any teaching full time or anything like that. Could be something I do in the future. Grad school was fun. I have some really good memories of grad school. One was just the camaraderie, right? That we were in a team. The Engine Research Center there was a group of many students. We had the experimental people that they lived in the basement because that's where all their experimental dynos and cells were, their engine cells. We were on the 10th floor in the building, and we were all doing kind of different topics of CFD, all related to engines somehow, or most of us. And we really fed off each other and really worked together to kind of get projects done. It wasn't the atmosphere wasn't, I just need to get my work done and graduate as soon as possible. Although that wasn't everybody's back of their minds. It was, let's lift up the whole group, right? And so I remember spending a lot of time helping my classmates with their projects and vice versa as well. So that camaraderie that was there, I have a really fond memory of. I have a fond memory of the professors. We had some brilliant professors. My advisor, Ralph Rates, Professor Dave Foster, and just a whole group of brilliant professors back then. The other thing that I really owe a lot to my grad school days was I was not a good public speaker when I entered graduate school. And I was nervous, right? I was very nervous. And people, when I tell that to people today, they say, well, that can't be true, right? Because I spend a lot of my time speaking. That's what I do. But I really was not a good public speaker. I was very nervous. I would prepare like crazy. I'd practice, over practice. And I was very fortunate that my advisor, Professor Rates, he allowed his students, and a lot of professors do this, right? Not all of them, but he allowed me, even from the very beginning in grad school, to present my paper at a conference. He didn't present it. A more senior student didn't present it. I presented it. And so I was scared to death. This was back in the late 90s, mid to late 90s. And it was my first SAE conference, and I was scared to death. And when I was done, the session organizer, I won't name him here, but very, very good guy. He said, wow, that was great. He went over to my advisor and told him how, and just that gave me so much confidence that, wow, I can actually do this. Right. So just Professor Rates giving me that opportunity to do that. And then I went on and gave a lot of talks after that. But that was something I really owed in my graduate school days. Just those kinds of opportunities and just having the opportunity to network with people as well in the industry. That also really helped later on when we formed our company. So yeah, I have a lot of really fond memories, both undergrad and grad school.
Really nice. You surely had a life in your college. So next question I would like to ask, what do you like to do when you are free, in your free time, your hobbies?
Yeah. So I talked about music a little bit before. I still like to do that. I don't have as much time as I used to, maybe. Although, all of these things, I could probably create some time. I just choose to prioritize other things. But I do still dabble in music. I have a little music studio in my basement. I have drums, guitars, keyboards, everything. My younger son is very musical. My older son was musical as well, but my younger son is particularly musical. So he'll probably inherit. He's 11 years old. He'll probably inherit all of the stuff in that room, all of the equipment at some point. He plays saxophone and piano. So sometimes we jam. That's fun, or we record. We record some music. I listen to a lot of music. I really love going to live music concerts and musical theater as well, Broadway shows, things like that. I'm a big fan. Hamilton is probably my favorite musical theater show, followed by Wicked, maybe as number 2. I like movies. I like binging Netflix sometimes, things like that. Although as I get older and older, I tend to not be able to do that as much. I just fall asleep. But yeah, I'm very much into that. And of course, my family. I spend a lot of time with my wife and my kids and traveling and things like that.
Have you ever been have you ever had such a hobby that you would just like to sit alone and just think about your topic of CFD or LCA or hybrid engines? Like a lot of people do that. I know, like when I read your book and I read his paper simultaneously, I used to just sit and think about how my viewpoint has changed after reading them. So did you have any phase like this in your life ever?
Where I just sat and thought about one of these topics?
Different things. Yeah.
Well, I can tell you one thing I sat and thought a lot about was when I was a freshman in undergrad, okay, I was in a new town. I didn't know anybody, but I wanted to continue to play in bands. So I went around to the music shops in town where they would put ads up, and I was playing bass at the time, bass guitar. And I went around and found ads, and one of them said, heavy metal band looking for bass guitarist. And I'm like, okay, I'll give that a shot. So I called these guys up and they said, yeah, come on over and rehearse with us. And I gelled with these guys. I mean, they were like way taller than me, all leather. Like, think about the stereotypical heavy metal musician. That's what they look like. I look nothing like that. I was like in my polo shirt, you know, physics major. Well, what happened is they wanted to, they actually wanted to start going on tour and they wanted me to come with them. And I would have toured the US and maybe beyond after that. I had to make a decision. I was like, and I sat and thought with that for a long time. Like, do I do like the moonshot music thing that like as a kid I always loved, or do I stick with college? I could always come back to college later, but would I? Stuff like that. So I had to make that decision about, and I ended up deciding, you know, I told them no. And, you know, who knows what would have happened. But I'm glad I did, because obviously a lot of good things came out of staying there. But that was something hobby related that I really had to kind of ponder for a while. The other one that's more related to kind of what you mentioned is, yeah, back in the early days of conceptualizing the book. And Felix and I would also sit and talk about this quite a bit. It's like, what is the message we want to convey? Do we want this book to be for experts? Do we want this book to be for the general public, or do we want it to be somewhere in between? And really thinking about we tried to kind of walk that line between the two, right? So like my son can read it, who isn't an expert on these topics, and get something out of it. But an engineer like yourself can read the book and also get something out of it, right? And so that's really something we thought about a lot, is how do we convey that message? And should we had publishers early on tell us, you have to pick a lane. You can't do this thing in the middle. You got to pick one or the other. And we said, well, we're not going to do our book with you then, because our vision is walking down that, you know, that middle road. And SAE fortunately saw that vision and supported us. And so that's why we ended up going with SAE as our publisher. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question specifically, but maybe I gave you some funny stories or some things to think about there.
Yeah.
The world is probably a better place that I didn't go and do music professionally. So
really nice talking to you, by the way.
Yeah, nice talking
I
to you
guess we
too.
were done with our questions pretty early. We are done with our questions.
Okay.
But no, yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to talk about just informally, or should we wrap this up?
You know, I think we hit on a lot of topics. I just want to invite the audience to like keep an open mind when you're thinking about transportation technologies. There is no one size fits all solution, right? There certainly are better solutions in different parts of the world. But you know, what we're finding now is that this idea that the future is eclectic is really coming to fruition. And it's not just about hybrid vehicles, it's also about different fuels, right? We didn't really touch much on that, but you know, the IC engine isn't really the problem when it comes to emissions and carbon. It's the fuel, right? So if we can do renewable fuels, e-fuels, hydrogen, things like that, they all have their challenges. Don't get me wrong. They're all like still, some of them are still in their infancy as far as like developing the technology and stuff like that. But it's all things that we need to keep looking at, along with the battery electric vehicle, which I do think is a big part of the future as well. So I'd say that. And the other thing I would say from, you know, if you're a student, because I imagine there'll be several students that might watch this. One thing I've always done in my career is, just because something is controversial doesn't mean you shouldn't push it forward. I've done this in papers, academic papers, when I was in grad school, all the way up through, you know, the advocacy that I do now. You know, if you're doing something where everybody 100% agrees with you, you're probably not doing something that interesting, right? So the real interesting stuff is where you're pushing the boundaries, and you may get some bad reviews. You may get some people that, you know, you may get a paper rejected because you're not doing it like everybody else does it or something like that. I've been through all of that. And at the end, you know, now I can tell you many examples, even in our CFD solver, where we wanted to do something one way, it was against the status quo. We were originally rejected, our papers, and now everybody in the industry is doing it that way, right? So you got to stick with it. And eventually, if the idea is solid and it's right and the science supports it, you'll win, essentially. So I guess I'd like to leave the audience with those two nuggets as takeaways. But yeah, it's been my pleasure to talk to you today. This has been a lot of fun. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. We too enjoyed it on our end a lot, like talking about your university life and other things. It was really nice. Like,
Great.
it was a good.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
All
Thanks
right,
a
take
lot, sir,
care.
for coming up.
Yep. Bye.